Last week, we looked at Abraham and Sarah's story, which is found in Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Today, we're going to pick up the story where Genesis ends. Genesis concludes with the Israelites in Goshen. And you'll see that we've provided a map as an insert in your worship program. We have the map up here. I know it's too small to read up here, but it is readable in the insert that we've given you. And you can see Goshen on the left-hand side of the map in the Nile Delta region. So the first 5 books of the Bible are called the Pentateuch, and they're also known as the books of Moses. After Genesis, you get these 4 books: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Here's a quick summary of these 4 books. The first half of Exodus describes the deliverance of God's people out of Egypt. The second half describes the law that God gives the Israelites. Leviticus also describes the law that God gives the Israelites. Numbers is the story of the Israelites' journey toward the Promised Land. And Deuteronomy is Moses' final words, his last lecture, so to speak. It's the words that Moses speaks to the people as they are about to enter Canaan, the Promised Land. This morning, we're going to walk through the rest of the Pentateuch, from Exodus through Deuteronomy. And in doing so, I'm going to lean heavily on insights from Adam Hamilton. And after looking at the Pentateuch's overall storyline, we're going to focus in on one of its themes to see how this speaks to our lives today and how it offers us good news. So let's begin with Exodus. Genesis ends with the Israelites being welcomed into Goshen. Exodus begins generations later with a new Pharaoh who is threatened by the Israelites, and so he makes them slaves. We're told in Exodus 1 that the work of the Israelites, the work they're forced to do, is to build the cities of Pithom and Ramesses. You can see these 2 cities on the left-hand side of the map that we've provided. Ramesses is listed as number 1 on this map. Now, we're also told that the Israelites build these towns using mud bricks with straw. Archaeologists have found the ruins of these cities, and here's a picture of the ruins of Pithom. And these ruins confirm that they were built using mud bricks, just as Exodus describes. The name of the city Ramesses is significant because Ramesses II, who lived in the 1200 BC time, was one of the most powerful and longest ruling pharaohs in Egypt's history. It's believed that he named this city after himself and that he is the pharaoh that God called Moses to confront. Ramesses was the most powerful person on the face of the planet. His statues were all over, and some are still standing today. Here's one of them. His name meant son of Ra, and Ra was the sun god, the supreme Egyptian god. So he wasn't just a powerful leader, he was someone who claimed to be divine. The mummy of Ramesses was found several decades ago, and it sits in the Cairo Museum. Here's what Ramesses looks like today. Okay. Kind of creepy, right? No? Kind of hard to see, maybe? But that's actually in the Cairo Museum. And I want us to see this picture simply to remind us that Exodus speaks of a real story with real people and real events. When Moses is 80 years old and living in Midian, in what is today the western side of Saudi Arabia, God speaks to him out of a burning bush. And God says, I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave master, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come to do something about it, to free them from their slavery. So go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt. Moses must have felt totally intimidated by this call. An 80-year-old goat herder versus the most powerful person on the planet. The odds are seriously stacked against Moses. And Moses responds to God's call by doing his best to get out of it. Moses says, "Who am I? Find someone else." But God says, "I want you." Then Moses says, "Nobody will believe me. Find somebody else." But God says, "I want you." Then Moses says, "I stutter. I'm really not good at public speaking. Not my thing at all. Find someone else." But God says, "I want you." And then Moses just says, I love this line, "Lord, please send someone else." Like, that's literally what he says. "Lord, please send someone else." But God says, "I'm calling you, and I will be with you." So Moses, who's 80, partners up with his older brother Aaron, who's 83. We got this strong combo here. And they go to Pharaoh. And they say, "God has told you, Pharaoh, let my people go." Now, Pharaoh hears this and says, "Who is this Yahweh that I should obey him and let Israel go? I don't know Yahweh, and why should I care what Yahweh thinks?" And Pharaoh's only response to Moses is to oppress the Israelites more. So God starts sending plagues on the Egyptians. But Pharaoh won't budge. So finally God sends one devastating plague, the plague of the firstborn. God tells Moses, "About midnight, I'm going to go throughout Egypt, and every firstborn son in Egypt will die. Here's what I want the Israelites to do. Have them eat one last supper, one last meal as slaves in Egypt. For this meal, roast a lamb, but before you do, take some of the blood of the lamb and put it on your doorsteps. And when I see the blood of the lamb on the doorstep, I will pass over that home." Hence, this meal became known as the Passover meal. As part of this meal, the people eat unleavened bread. Bread that hasn't had time to rise because they were in such a hurry to eat and to get out. And God says, each year, I want you to celebrate a festival of unleavened bread as a way of remembering that you were once slaves in Egypt, but now you are free. When God sends this final plague, Pharaoh says, "Go." And the Israelites are free. It's hard to overestimate the significance of the Exodus. It is the defining event of the Israelites. The defining event of the Jewish people. As I heard one rabbi recently describe it, this rabbi said this: "Every morning and every evening in our prayers, we remind ourselves that we were slaves in Egypt and God delivered us. We have not just one, but 2 holidays remembering this event. Every Friday night, as part of the Shabbat meal, we remind ourselves that we were slaves in Egypt. When we celebrate the Passover Seder, we retell the story of the Exodus. The meaning of this story is that God heard us once, God will hear us again. God delivered us once, God will deliver us again." That's the perspective of a contemporary Jewish rabbi. And when we turn to the New Testament, we see the theme of the Exodus story woven throughout it. At the Last Supper, Jesus is sharing the Passover Seder with his disciples, and he infuses this meal with new meaning. He says that the unleavened bread now represents his body broken for us, and the wine represents his blood given to deliver us not from slavery in Egypt, but from sin and death. We were once slaves to sin and death, But now through the blood of the Lamb, through Jesus Christ himself, we are free. We see the same Exodus theme in Romans 6, where Paul describes how Christians come through the waters of baptism, much like the Israelites passing through the Red Sea, and therefore leave behind this land of slavery and enter into God's new freedom. Paul's good news is that we are no longer slaves to sin. As he puts it in Galatians 5, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourself be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. In the book of Exodus, God sets his people free. They miraculously pass through the Red Sea and travel south through the Sinai Peninsula until they come to Mount Sinai, which is also known as Mount Horeb. You can see the location of this mountain on your map. It's listed as number 8 on the map. Here is a photo from the top of Mount Sinai. This picture shows what kind of rugged yet beautiful terrain the Israelites travel through. Moses goes up to the top of Mount Sinai for 40 days, where he fasts, prays, and spends time with God. And at the end of these 40 days, he comes down with the 10 commandments and the rest of the law. 613 commandments in all. The second half of Exodus and the book of Leviticus discuss this law, God's law, in detail. The Israelites camp out at Mount Sinai for a year, and then they make their journey toward the Promised Land, as described in the book of Numbers. Now, in Numbers 13, as they get right to the edge of the Promised Land, God tells them to send out scouts to check out the land. So 12 scouts go out. They check out the Promised Land. 10 of them come back and say, the people there are giants. We are like grasshoppers compared to them. There is no way we should go there. We should go back to Egypt. Let's return to Egypt. When God hears this, he's not very happy. God says, these folks have seen what I've done, yet they have disobeyed and tested me time and time again. None of them who have resisted me will enter the Promised Land. The Israelites then wander in the wilderness for 40 years. At the end of these 40 years, they arrive at the foot of Mount Nebo. That's where the book of Numbers ends and the book of Deuteronomy begins. Deuteronomy is Moses' final words to the Israelites before they enter the Promised Land. You can see Mount Nebo on your map as number 15. It's just east of the Jordan River, near the Dead Sea, and it's within eyeshot of the Promised Land. In fact, here is a view from Mount Nebo looking into the Promised Land. The book of Deuteronomy ends with Moses climbing Mount Nebo and taking in this view. That's where the Pentateuch ends. Moses, he climbs up the mountain, he surveys all the land that the Israelites are going to inherit, and then he dies at the ripe old age of 120. That's where the Pentateuch ends. It's quite a story. We just covered a lot very briefly. In fact, it's an amazing story. And now I simply want to ask, how does this story relate to our lives today? What difference does it make this week? Well, in thinking about that question, the one word that comes to mind for me is freedom. This is a story about freedom. God's freedom. And I believe that many of us are looking for freedom. I believe that many folks in Kailua, throughout Oahu, long for freedom. As I mentioned earlier, in Galatians 5, Paul writes, It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourself be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. In what ways can we be burdened by a yoke of slavery? What can bind or control us? Who or what can be our slave master? Let me mention 3 things. The first and biggest is death and the fear of death. As a society, we fear death so much that we do everything in our power to avoid it, to deny it, to pretend it doesn't exist. Yet death stands over each and every one of us like the ultimate Ramesses saying, I've got you and there's nothing you can do about it. In Hebrews 2, there's a really interesting verse that says, Jesus shared in our humanity so that by his death, he might break the power of death and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Isn't that an interesting verse? The fear of death can hold us in slavery. As long as we fear death, we're not free. God desires to free us from our fear of death. Another slave master is addiction. One of the defining marks of our culture, one of the defining marks of this generation is addiction. We're free to do whatever we want, and the result is that we're bound as never before. Addiction to alcohol, addiction to narcotics, addiction to painkillers, addiction to tobacco, addiction to pornography, addiction to food, addiction to gambling, addiction to video games, addiction to shopping, addiction to the internet. The list goes on and on. There are United Methodist churches that have 30 to 40 recovery groups that meet weekly in their facilities. My guess is that every family here today has been impacted by addiction, acknowledged or unacknowledged. And as we know, whatever we're addicted to becomes our slave master. We are controlled by it. We are not free. God desires to free us from our addictions. Another slave master is sin, which is Scripture's way of describing what our culture often calls addiction. In Romans 7, Paul describes our struggle with sin this way. He says, the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I don't understand what I do. For what I want to do, I don't do. But what I hate, I end up doing. I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. Instead, I keep on doing what I don't want to do. Anyone relate? I know I can. Definitely. I know John Wesley can. John Wesley founded the Methodist Church after he became a Christian, and after he became an Anglican priest, and after he became a missionary to America. He was still crying out, "Who will deliver me?" That's how Paul ends that section in Romans 7. Who will deliver me? Here's how John Wesley describes his struggle with sin. He says, in this state of bondage to sin, I was indeed fighting continually, but not conquering. Before, I had willingly served sin. Now it was unwillingly, but still I served it. Wesley then had a powerful experience of God's presence. At a church on Aldersgate Street in London, he encountered God in a very meaningful way, and through that, he experienced a new power to live in God's freedom. After this experience, Wesley wrote, "Before I was sometimes, if not often, conquered. Now I was able to conquer." Sin was no longer his slave master. Something has changed. In a line that I love, Wesley said, "Sin remains, but no longer reigns." Sin remains, but no longer reigns. That's good news. That's the freedom God offers us. So let me ask you this question. Who or what is your Ramesses? Who or what is your slave master? See, based on my experience, I think we often learn to live with our slave master. We get used to it. We convince ourselves, it's not that bad in Egypt. And we stop believing that freedom is possible. But when we look at the story of Moses and the Exodus, we see that God wants us to be free and that God has the power to free us.